Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. The first atomic bomb test successfully exploded on July 16, 1945, exactly 75 years ago. One of the observers at the time said it felt like being present at the creation. When William L. Lawrence, the New York Times reporter embedded with the Manhattan Project, wasn't allowed to tell his wife what he was doing when he went off for long periods of time, he would just tell her, "It's Buck Rogers stuff." And upon that first explosion, Lawrence would write, "It was as though the earth had opened and the skies had split. One felt as though one were present at the moment of creation, when God said, 'Let there be light.'" It's no accident, then, that anything so secret, so cinematic, so filled with great characters, even though filled with destruction, would be fodder for Hollywood. Louis B. Mayer in 1945 called the story of the atomic bomb one of the most important stories. But it's no surprise that the culture of Washington, science, the Manhattan Project, and the cowboys of Hollywood were not meant to coexist. The story of what happened is worthy of a Hollywood film unto itself. But it's in fact the story that Greg Mitchell tells in his new book, The Beginning or the End. It is my pleasure to welcome Greg Mitchell to talk about The Beginning or the End, how Hollywood and America learned to stop worrying and love the bomb. Greg, thanks so much for joining us on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Happy to be here.
How did you come to this story, first of all?
Well, I've been involved, or some might say obsessed, with the atomic bombing since 1982, when I became the editor of Nuclear Times magazine, which was the Bible of the anti-nuclear movement of the 80s. I then got a journalistic grant to go to Hiroshima in 1984, and I've written 3 books since, and dozens of articles, and probably thousands of blog posts. I found out about this movie actually at the Truman Library, where I was researching another book, and found that they had a whole file on it there, which very few people had ever seen. And it had this correspondence between Truman's press secretary and MGM, and the order from the White House to reshoot really the key scene in the movie where Truman explains his decision to use the bomb, and other back and forth, which kind of blew my mind at this unprecedented White House intervention in a Hollywood movie. This was not wartime. It was a year after the war ended. And MGM caved completely. So it kind of went from there. I wrote a little bit about it. I kind of did more research over the years, and finally, a couple of years ago, decided to embark on a full treatment with much additional research at the Motion Picture Academy in L.A. with the Oppenheimer papers and Einstein papers and much more.
And talk a little bit about the way this project evolved at MGM. Louis Mayer was excited about it. He thought that was an important story. How did the project get started at the studio?
Well, it was kind of amazing in a way. And this is really how the book starts. The actress Donna Reed, who many will remember, got a letter out in Santa Monica from her high school chemistry teacher named Ed Tompkins. And he said he had disappeared, and he had gone into the top secret Manhattan Project, and he was writing her. Now, this was 2 months after Hiroshima, that could she urgently get Hollywood to make a major movie about the bomb, warning the world of the dangers of going down the nuclear path, building more weapons, building bigger weapons such as the H-bomb. Likelihood of an arms race with the Soviets, and just urging her to get a movie done. Her husband happened to be a Hollywood agent. He soon was sitting down with Louis B. Mayer, as you said. Mayer jumped on it, called it the most important movie he would ever make, and they started, doing scripts. And what the book really covers, among other things, is how this original idea for this movie warning the world from the scientist's perspective was slowly transformed through numerous script revisions and cuts into what became pro-bomb propaganda, basically, in the next year. And so I was able to get access to all the scripts and memos and so on and so forth. So I'm the first person to trace this transformation. And the transformation, based on going through the papers of Truman and General Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project, able to see how the real reason for this was that both Groves and Truman were given script approval, again, totally unprecedented, and they were allowed to read the scripts and force dozens of cuts and revisions, and all in the direction of defending the bomb and defending the use of the bomb against Japan.
I mean, in that sense, it is a classic Hollywood story because it didn't happen all at once. It was one of those stories where there were revisions and lots of cooks in the proverbial soup, and little by little, the project entirely morphed into something 180 degrees from where it started.
Yeah, well, the story can be told now for the first time, based on seeing all the documents and scripts and so forth. And, what's revealing, I mean, the book is, it's sort of entertaining and lively because it's partly a Hollywood story, of course, and then it's sort of more profound as we talk about the use of the bomb and the aftermath of the use of the bomb and so on and so forth. So it's sort of a combination of that. But what the details that come out are just what's most revealing in some cases is the actual cuts or falsifications that were made in the script. To mention just one thing, there are many people who still endorse the use of the bomb against Hiroshima, but who will then say in the next breath, but Nagasaki was wrong, or even Nagasaki was a war crime. So in the original scripts for the movie, they had plenty of scenes with the second bombing of Nagasaki and so on. But as time went on, they cut every single mention of Nagasaki from the movie. So you could watch it tonight and have no idea there was even a second bomb. So it's that kind of thing that is revealing in what is done. This is not an academic book that lays out in 600 pages all the factual details of the bomb and everything else. It reveals what actually happened and the key issues and why America is still, I feel, endangered by the fact we used the bomb 75 years ago. But it's laid out in the narrative of this revisions in this Hollywood movie.
Talk a little bit about who the writers were, how it evolved, who the players were inside MGM and with respect to the script.
They hired Bob Considine, who was the author of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, a famous World War II book, also famous as a Hearst columnist. So he wrote kind of the lengthy first story for the movie, and then it was given for screenwriting to Frank Weed, who was a famous flyer, aviator, wartime and peacetime flyer, and he wrote the script, and then plenty of cooks got involved in revising and so on and so forth. So the movie very quickly went from, as I've said, inspired by the scientists to being turned over to very much pro-military, pro-bomb writers. Louis B. Mayer, of course, was a very conservative Republican activist. Hollywood, contrary to what people may think today, was basically run by conservatives then. So in some ways, it's not surprising that the movie got twisted over time. I think what's more shocking, probably to some, is such close, detailed intervention by General Groves and by Truman, and so they just were allowed by MGM to have kind of a free hand with the script. I should also mention that this was all of this intrigue was at the same time this was going on. There were two other very interesting things happening. One was that the MGM had to get permissions from people they wanted to portray, had to get written contract releases to be portrayed. And so there's a great subplot in the book about them chasing after Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer and other famous scientists to get them to sign. And then secondly, there was a competing movie from Paramount with the script by Ayn Rand, no less. Most people don't even know that Ayn Rand was, had written some screenplays, and so she was hired to write a really wild screenplay by Paramount. And so again, for the first time, we sort of traced the development of that project and Ayn Rand's script and her memos, and ultimately, partly because her script was so wacky, Paramount then sold out to MGM, and so her movie never appeared, but she took this free time to write a little book called Atlas Shrugged, and so that's how that movie developed.
What was the Ayn Rand script like?
Well, it was, as one could imagine, it was very, I would say, pro-capitalist. It was also pro-individual. In her view, the real heroes of the Manhattan Project were not, Franklin Roosevelt for, going down that path, or the group of scientists working together. It was basically industry, American industry, who helped fund it, and the individual scientist. The individual, like Oppenheimer, as the individual scientist who worked on their own, or pretty much on their own, to make this happen. Of course, she ignored the fact that actually it was a collaborative effort, the fact that Oppenheimer was under the thumb of the military and Groves. But she had quite a fanciful. It's much too much to go into, but it was quite a wild screenplay, and in some ways it would be wonderful to see if it had been made, to watch it and get a good chuckle over it.
How involved was Truman and the people around him in overseeing this and keeping an eye on it?
Well, again, briefly, the MGM kind of set this in motion when the producer and Donna Reed's husband sat down with Truman in the Oval Office very early on, and he actually titled the movie The Beginning or the End, which is also the title of my book. He gave them sort of the title for the movie, and from the very beginning, they sort of signaled that he could veto anything he didn't like in the movie. That then proceeded over time. Scripts were sent to the White House. They ordered certain things taken out. And then it culminates, kind of the climax of the book in some ways, is there was a screening in Washington in October of 1946 of the supposedly kind of finished film. And Truman's press secretary saw it along with many others, and was just appalled that the way it treated Truman's decision. And it didn't really explain why he dropped the bomb. It was more he sort of made the decision and then it happened, which left open to questions in any viewers about, was it right, or what did it actually, why was it necessary, and so forth. So he had to, and then Truman, when he read it, then decided to order a complete retake, a reshoot of that kind of costly scene. And so they kind of marked up a script, and it was then filmed by MGM word for word after the White House approval. And it's if anyone dares to watch the movie today, it's available streaming on DVD, and Turner Classics, which owns it, airs it. I suspect it'll be aired in the coming days for the 75th anniversary. It does lead up to this scene where Truman at Potsdam, 3 weeks before dropping the bomb, tells his secretary exactly why he was going to do it, and it was laid out what I call the Hiroshima narrative that still endures to this day, which is that it was the only way to end the war, saved 1 million American lives. There was nothing else we could do. The bomb is actually a great thing for America, and so on. So that's pretty incredible direct involvement in a movie, especially in peacetime. And so I've got excerpts from the script, and of course all the letters back and forth between MGM and the White House, and It's a pretty amazing episode.
One of the other things that it just brings into bold relief as this story unfolds is how insecure Truman and the administration was about the decision they had made. If they felt stronger about it or better about it, their actions here might have played out differently.
Yeah, it is surprising in some ways because as I relate in the book, there's no question that after we dropped the bomb and the war ended, and shortly after, that most Americans, the vast majority, supported use of the bomb, and you can understand why. After this horrible, long, and deadly war, for the war to end, however it ended, was certainly something to celebrate. So the bomb was very much tied to that, and their historians debate to this day whether the bomb was the main cause for the Japanese surrender or was Russia's sudden entry into the war, or whether it was the U.S. signaling we would allow them to keep their emperor. There are at least three major factors there, but nonetheless, there's no question that people endorsed the view, and that remained. And but nevertheless, the White House and the people who made the bomb, certainly Oppenheimer and others, were extremely nervous about how that decision would be viewed. Now, you might say maybe they felt some guilt, possibly, or they felt the decision really wasn't necessary, and that this would kind of be disclosed, or people would get this inkling. It's a moral shock. Now, most people are able to overcome that, but when you kill 200,000 civilians, within 3 days, it's something to be something to weigh on you, and so I think there was that fear. So all these revisions in the movie are interesting because we do see, even down to the details of, they didn't want to show the bombers heading for Hiroshima as what actually happened. Was they flew there, they were undetected, beautiful morning, no opposition from the Japanese, dropped the bomb, flew away. Instead, they have to show that it was somehow risky and brave and
Right.
Might not have happened. So they first introduced in the script that there's some anti-aircraft fire and flak, and then it became heavy flak, and then ultimately there was a script with Japanese fighters in the distance ready to fire on them. So they couldn't just show it the way it happened. They had to build up the American bravery, and I could give you 10 more examples in that vein, where this narrative had to be sustained even if things were falsified.
How did the scientists, Oppenheimer, Einstein, etc., how did they feel about the movie and the project?
One of the real subplots is this MGM chasing after the Einstein and Leo Szilard, who is one of the key scientists, Oppenheimer, chasing after them to get their permissions. And these scientists were extremely opposed to being involved with the movie at first. They either just in general, they knew coming from MGM it would probably be a schlocky, Hollywood epic, or they just felt the subject was too sensitive to be depicted. They felt conflicted feelings, and so MGM chased them. Ultimately, they wore down Einstein and Szilard, and then there's quite a bit about the always fascinating figure of Oppenheimer, and how, in his usual way, he was very conflicted. And then there's a scene where the movie's producer comes to his home in Berkeley, and there's quite a detailed record of that, and how Oppenheimer finally caved and then made fun. And I have a full disclosure of Oppenheimer then mocking the movie and making fun of the whole thing. And so it was kind of classic Oppenheimer, but all of those scientists ultimately signed this release, and so they are depicted in the movie rather poorly, but they are depicted. The other fascinating thing is that each of those three very, very famous scientists I just mentioned were also under FBI surveillance during that year. Each of them was suspected by J. Edgar Hoover of communist connections or communist sympathy. Oppenheimer was most vulnerable because his wife is a former communist, her brother was a former communist, his mistress, who had recently killed herself, was a former communist. And so the FBI had extensive surveillance of these three men. Oppenheimer's phone was tapped. In fact, I have a sort of published for the first time a lengthy transcript of Oppenheimer talking to his wife from across the country about this movie, making fun of this movie, and so on, all captured on FBI wiretap. So, like I said, there's a lot going on. This movie is set in 1946, which is a real turning point for post-war America. The Cold War really started. Secrecy began. The Hollywood blacklist began. We really were the first atomic tests in the Pacific were carried out. The path to making the H-bomb was developed. So this book is really a full probing of this incredible turning point year, and again, the movie somehow serves as a great vehicle to study these things.
And the movie as a vehicle and the story that you tell is far more interesting than the movie itself. Talk about the fact that the movie was such a flop.
Well, one reason it was a flop, and it wasn't a total flop. I think people will, and of course it's fun to call it a bomb. It bombed at the box office and all that. But it got mixed reviews, including the New York Times and a lot of other places. And at the box office, it didn't do well, and it lost money. It's true, but it was not a complete failure. But in any case, one reason for it was the fact that the MGM was so open to the revisions and was continually rewriting. And then, of course, as I mentioned, this ultimate reshoot ordered by Truman delayed the release of the movie by months. And so when it finally came out, a year and a half had passed since the bombing, and back in those days, Hollywood could really churn these out, So more than a year and a half after Hiroshima, the movie came out, and so it was difficult to overcome that. And it's not a good movie, because it's so cobbled together, and there's elements of there's like a fake newsreel in it. There's two love stories are grafted into it. None of the stars were the A level, ultimately. So maybe it was kind of doomed by basically by MGM maybe losing faith and turning it over to Washington.
As you look at the period that came later in the 50s and even into the early 60s a little bit, what is your sense of how Hollywood has dealt with the bomb, with nuclear issues, etc.?
Right. Well, the amazing thing is, while most people would say, oh, God, there's been so many movies with the bomb, and of course many famous ones such as Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove, and many science fiction movies that in a way warned about nuclear radiation and things, even Godzilla,
On the Beach.
Yeah, On the Beach is a great example. Maybe not so many since the 1960s, I have to say, but but in 75 years, there have only been 3 movies from Hollywood about the making and the use of the bomb. There was this movie, The Beginning or the End. About 5 years after that, MGM did a kind of sequel, even using some of the same footage, portraying the pilot who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, Paul Tibbets, played by Robert Taylor. And then not a single movie for 37 years until Roland Joffe, who directed The Killing Fields and other movies, made a movie called Fat Man and Little Boy, which also did poorly. He had intended it as kind of an anti-bomb movie, but then he made the fatal mistake of casting Paul Newman as Leslie Groves, and then a total unknown as Oppenheimer. So this was supposed to be a great duel between the two of them, and he's got an unknown on one side and Paul Newman as General Groves. So that movie was also doomed, and there hasn't been one since then, 30 years. So I think that speaks for itself. 3 movies in 75 years on one of the, if not the most important single event of the 20th century. And even the movies that did tackle it did it in a kind of sideways manner.
And yet what's interesting is how many people have a sense of the Manhattan Project and what happened and who the players were from what limited movies there were.
Yeah, I mean, there have been numerous documentaries, especially about Oppenheimer and, History Channel and everything else. There's no question you can find documentaries on this, the specials. There'll maybe even this year there may be a network special or two, that kind of thing. But it's all based on fact, not not drama, not Hollywood drama, big budget, big audience kind of thing. So again, that's very revealing, and I think and there's been much more attention on the making of the bomb than on the using of the bomb. And as I wrote a book with Robert J. Lifton called Hiroshima in America, and which we call Hiroshima America's Raw Nerve. And I think that's, they don't really want to depict what happened on the ground. They want to show the making of the bomb and the great scientific achievement, and then they want to show the end of the war. But what happened on the ground is very tough for Americans to handle because, as I've said, there were probably at least 200,000 killed, maybe more than that, and 90% of them were civilians. In fact, in the case of Nagasaki, they've only been able to identify maybe 150 military personnel. So you have maybe 90,000 civilians and 150 military. Now, that's difficult to depict, I mean, it's one thing to show, for Hollywood to show other war crimes or terrible war aftermaths and civilian carnage that are committed by other nations. But it's very, very difficult to show that we did it. And of course there is a great historical debate. Could it have been avoided? Should it have been avoided? But nevertheless, we did it. And that can't be taken away. So, but America doesn't really want to face that and have sort of an honest debate about it.
Greg Mitchell, his book is The Beginning or the End, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Greg, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Jeff, anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.